Written and narrated by Sana Pirzada. Chapter 1: Scars of the War. Patience is paramount in life. Sooner or later, what we yearn for, what we strive for, comes to us. But at times we capitulate to our worst fears, thinking we may never see that crock of gold at the end of the rainbow. This is how I felt in the spring of 1945. The war had taken a toll on our nation. I lived through the worst. I remember how the German Blitz ravaged my beautiful London. I was there. Those sirens will haunt me for life. For days and nights, Mother and I joined hundreds of others in the underground, seeking refuge from the bombs. Our beloved London had been ripped before our eyes. The beautiful churches we would often visit and the wondrous roads we would walk on were now torn asunder. I remember the day Mother and I sat at the table with a group of friends for a dinner, which was supposed to serve as a respite from our ongoing suffering. We resided at a small cottage in close proximity to Hampstead Heath. It was considered a serene and safe locality. As we commenced dinner, we heard a whistle. It was excruciatingly shrill and seemed to pierce my eardrums. Before we could determine what was happening or what course of action to take, our windows shattered. The cottage itself seemed to rock as if a tremor had struck, and the chandelier hanging above the dining table oscillated vigorously. Everything in the dining room swayed, and the crystal pieces adorning the shelves fell, smashing to smithereens. The portraits hanging on the walls fell to the ground, and shattered glass glistened everywhere. Nostalgic portraits of father, mother, Arthur, my husband, and myself, and beautiful memories captured of our family holidays in Brighton, of my childhood and my beautiful wedding, all lay shattered. Our cottage had survived the explosion, but numerous surrounding houses and buildings were obliterated. We continued to live there, but when the air raid sirens sounded, we would retreat to the underground shelter. It had become a custom of mine to visit the post office each day to see if there was any telegram from Arthur, but the usual response broke my heart. No telegram from Captain Mallory of the Royal Sussex Regiment. The Royal Sussex Regiment had fought in North Africa initially, and then in Italy in 1943. It was not until later that year that I received the long-awaited, dreaded telegram from the regiment that read, "The Secretary for War desires me to express his deepest regret that Captain Arthur Mallory of the Royal Sussex Regiment went missing in action and presumed dead on the 3rd of September in Italy." My world had officially fallen apart. Arthur and I had met at a party 15 years before, and we married after a whirlwind romance. After Father's death, Arthur and I decided to move in with Mother. He looked after her as if she were his own. A part of me died with Arthur. The sadness of not being able to see his body one final time and not being able to bury him left me in a state of utter sorrow. He was my companion and my soulmate. He was the only man I ever loved. I could not complain, though. Everyone had lost someone. Many had lost loved ones during these cataclysmic wars. Families were separated. Innocent children became orphans overnight. Men went to war and never returned, leaving their wives bereft. At the time, it felt this apocalypse would never end. As a nurse, it was my duty to attend to wounded soldiers at St. Mary's Hospital. It was a visceral sight to see young men with torn limbs and blood-drenched clothing, to listen to their screams and cries, watching their loved ones weep beside them. All of this was not for the faint-hearted. I knew Mother could never have done what I did, but in my generation, women couldn't afford to be weak or cowardly. In many ways, I was, and had to be, braver than a man. But I admit my heart broke each time I saw a soldier take his final breath before my eyes. Is this how Arthur died? I would wonder. But I kept my own sorrows suppressed for Mother's sake. Mother had suffered from a latent form of tuberculosis since she was a young woman, but she never quite told me how she contracted the disease. Now, this fatal malady had taken over her. She withered each day and coughed up blood. I took care of mother single handedly without fearing whether I would contract the disease from her, which miraculously I didn't. I covered my face with a surgical mask and wore prosthetic gloves as a precautionary measure, and administered medicines and vaccines to her. But alas, there was no hope of recovery. Mother was bedridden by this time and often remained languid. There were times I would jolt her out of her sleep when she would fail to answer me. I feared the worst. At times she would scream in deep sleep and gesticulate with her scrawny pale hand. "I will tell the world your story, Amelia," she would whisper under her breath. I had no clue as to who Amelia was, but one night before Mother's tragic demise, she asked me to retrieve an old satchel from the storeroom. "Open the satchel, Christine, for in it you shall find my journal and certain important papers. Read them all, but do so once I am gone. Oh, Christine, you have been so wonderful to me. Your father was so proud of you, as am I. Arthur will come back to you one day. Never lose hope, my dear." Mother spoke in her quivering voice, trying her best to console her grieving daughter. Poor mother. Her funeral had been a painful one at Highgate Cemetery. The only family I had left had now abandoned me. Of course, the war had given birth to camaraderie, and neighbors and friends offered comfort and solace. But mother's death and Arthur's disappearance had shaken me. When I remembered the satchel, I opened it to find the journal mother had mentioned, and to my utmost surprise, a last will and testament. According to the document, upon my mother's death, a certain property called Vernon Hall in Whitstable, Kent, would belong to me. I confess I didn't read the journal, but immediately took a train to this small town of Whitstable, which I had never been to before. Hitler had taken his own life, and there was word that the war was presumably coming to an end. But we lived in such unpredictable times. Who knew what was next? Leaving war-torn London behind filled my heart with melancholy. A melange of memories flashed across my mind. But at the same time, I had a strange feeling, a sort of uncertainty, if you like, about what lay ahead in Whitstable at this rather mysterious property called Vernon Hall. When I reached the sleepy and more or less abandoned town of Whitstable, I was surprised to see it hadn't been so gravely affected by the war. The German Blitz had destroyed much of England's historic coastlines. Luckily, Whitstable had survived by and large. I asked a few people if they were privy to the location of Vernon Hall. Most were oblivious. One old woman seemed startled by the name. "You mean the stone castle up on the hill?" she gasped. I don't know, madam. I've never been there before, but I really have to go. Pray do guide me, I pleaded. She was kind enough to guide me, but remained fearful. Of what, I didn't know, nor did I care to ask. I had seen so many destructive tragedies in the last few years that a house with some superstitious story did not really bother me. These were old wives' tales, and so I proceeded to Vernon Hall. It was a very dull castle, I have to say, what was left of it, that is. I could tell one side was bombed as the tower was crumbling. It was made of stone with turrets and large windows, and stood on the precipice of a cliff. I could see restless waves of the silver sea below, and suddenly felt a sense of déjà vu. I couldn't quite tell why, but as I approached the skeleton of a structure, I saw the flash of the figure of a man. He was wearing a Victorian suit and had long dark hair and very pale skin. Rather handsome, I would say. And then he disappeared. I dismissed these ideas as the fancies of a middle-aged woman. I was now in my 40s, and with Arthur gone, I blamed my own senses for seeing such fanciful sights. My train of thought was interrupted by an elderly masculine voice. "Who is it? What do you want, my dear?" queried the old man. He had broad shoulders, white long hair, and an amiable face that welcomed me with a warm smile. "Oh, I'm Mrs. Christine Mallory. I've come to see Vernon Hall," I replied. The old man looked at me intently for a moment, then asked again, "What is your business here, Mrs. Mallory? There's nothing to see at Vernon Hall. Can't you see?" He pointed to the crumbling turrets. "The war has left its mark on this once magnificent castle," he continued. "Why, this castle was right out of one of the Grimm brothers' fairy tales. It left people awe-stricken. And now?" He sounded forlorn. "'Tis nothing but a ruin. It will collapse any day." His voice quivered as he spoke. For a moment I thought his eyes had gone misty, but then he swallowed a lump and cleared his throat. "So do you wish to see the castle for historical purposes, Mrs. Mallory?" he asked curiously. "Mr. I looked at him inquiringly, wondering why he hadn't introduced himself to me. He hesitated a moment, then quickly said, "The name is Kit." "Well then, Mr. Kit, let me explain. You see, my mother died recently, but before she did, she left me a last will and testament, according to which this estate, that is, Vernon Hall, belongs to me. That is what brings me here." Mr. Kit looked utterly baffled. He scratched his head, looked sideways, and whispered, "My dear, what was your mother's name?" I told him mother's name was Eleanor and awaited a positive response. But alas, Mr. Kit appeared ever more surprised. "May I see this last will and testament?" he whispered. I showed him the document, which he scrutinized in much detail, reading and then rereading. He peered at the sentences. His eyesight was clearly weak, but he didn't wear glasses. "Seems you are right, dear lady. I'm sorry if I came across a bit hostile. It's just that there haven't been any visitors to Vernon Hall for years, and certainly no one has claimed title to the estate. I'm sorry to hear you've lost your mother, my dear. It must be difficult for you." Mr. Kit took my fragile hand in his stone-like and looked into my eyes sorrowfully. Due to his elderly disposition, he reminded me of father, and so I gently patted his arm. "It's all right, Mr. Kit. Mother was a strong woman who led a happy life. We were all so happy, but then the wars changed everything. My husband Captain Mallory, went off to war a few years ago. I've been told he was killed. I've had my share of anguish, Mr. Kit, so don't you worry about me." I tried my best to reassure him. He narrowed his eyes and stared for a few moments, contemplating something. I knew not what. Abruptly, he said, "Let me take you inside, my dear. Though I warn you, no one has seen or been inside the castle for decades, nor have I. Are you brave enough to face whatever you may find inside?" Normally, such superstition would not perturb me, but there was something in Mr. Kit's eyes, a sort of uncanny fear, and there was a queer chill in the atmosphere which made me shudder. What was it about this castle that Mother had concealed from me? Why did she never mention Vernon Hall to me? Or for that matter, why didn't Father? Well, I shook my head, and I shook all these conflicting thoughts away. And I answered, "I am ready to confront my worst fears in that castle, Mr. Kit. Will you be so kind as to lead the way?"